Hey, common scientists, we are coming to you this week with a biopic on Ada Lovelace. So we wanted to find a woman in history, and this week we've got an awesome woman in history, woman in science, and we're going to get to hear a little bit about her life, her story, her accomplishments, and then maybe a bit of her controversy. So I'll kick it to Aidan to start with a quote, and we'll dive into a bit of the life of Ada Lovelace.
So here's a quote from Ada. "The brain of mine is something more than mere mortal, as time will show." And that just, demonstrates to me the confidence that she had in her abilities, and the confidence that she had in her abilities in science and math and computer science, more specifically. And Ada was, one, ahead of her time. She was born in the Industrial Revolution when Queen Victoria takes to the throne. And she's known in particular for having published the first computer program. But before that, it took her lots of practice to get to that point. So she was born as the only daughter, to Lord Byron. And he's a famous, controversial poet. He was known for all sorts of wild and wacky. Do we need to restart?
No, what do you mean? What did I do? What did you restart? I was just laughing. I'm a big Lord Byron fan. So
You're a big Lord Byron fan?
He's a controversial guy.
And it's honestly fine that you said son, because history shows that he, now I'm doing it, that he, Lord Byron, wanted a son. And so much so that he was quite distraught, it seems, that my reading showed me, when he found out that he had a daughter instead. So if we screw up our pronouns, it's probably a little okay, maybe not, but in the context of the story, that Lord Byron wanted a son, and then out came Ada Lovelace. But I think despite his death earlier in her life, she probably exceeded his wildest expectations.
Yeah, that is kind of bizarre, because how she had to have been everything he could have ever asked for, right? I think he died when she was 7 or something like that.
Yeah, 7 or 8.
He abandoned her
young.
when she was just a couple months old and never really knew her. But it's just how, if you wanted a son, for what? So that he could be a super famous mathematician or mathematician and all that stuff, exactly what Ada Lovelace was, or what? What's the point of that?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it is quite remarkable. It's funny. One thing that you do say about the mathematician thing, I don't know if she would have been such a mathematician if he had stuck around, because he ended up, like Dre said, getting out of the picture when she was a 5-week-old baby, and she's his only legitimate daughter. And after he left, her mother was the one that was key in driving a lot of her math and science abilities. She was apparently pretty kind of, anti-Lord Byron after that fact, and wanted to, it seems to me, hammer out some of the poetry that was running through his mind, from her mind. But as we do see, her kind of art and science background definitely plays a role in her forward-thinking abilities. Dre, I'm just curious. You said you're a fan of Lord Byron. Why is that?
I just think he's an interesting character. I don't know. Yeah. He's obviously this escapading philanderer and all that stuff, which is, it's not that I necessarily agree with womanizing, but it's not that I necessarily disagree with it as well. It depends on what you're talking about, right? If you're just saying sleeping around, it's well, a woman can sleep around, a man can sleep around, a lot of people can sleep around, but it depends on kind of how you're looking at it now. With him abandoning his daughter and him abandoning his wife, that's stuff, what's up, what you doing? I didn't know all details about him before I became a fan. I just knew he had a couple of fire poems, and I was this guy's kind of a cool guy. But he's just kind of really an icon amongst writers and poets, and he's kind of what's his famous poem? Don Juan, right? Is that what it's called?
I'm not familiar.
I think it's Don Juan or something. But there's this idea of this Don Juan character who is semi-biographically based on Lord Byron, and it's just it seems like someone who would be mythical and makes all the ladies swoon and does this and
Oh,
does that,
funny.
and like, you know, rides around from town to town. And like, we've seen this movie over and over again, right? We've seen like Owen Wilson play characters like this and all these
Yeah.
different like
Like the noble whoever. Who,
right. So just like he just kind of lived that life, and he somehow, and it's kind of like a noble scoundrel or something like that, kind of like
Yeah.
the Johnny Depp Jack
Yeah.
Sparrow
Yeah,
character as
yeah.
well, where it's like
Totally.
somehow he's always seducing somebody into getting what he wants.
my
And
gosh.
as a watcher or a reader or whatever, we love it. But obviously, if you knew that person in real life, it's like you're gonna hate him. But
Oh my gosh.
he's like $10 million in debt, but he still somehow lives like in a mansion, or it's like
Right.
always like, I don't know, like
Yeah.
with like all these wealthy people, because he's just such a charmer. And I just think, it's not that I think he's a good person, but he's an amazing poet, and it's just like an amazing life. Like, it's like, how did this guy exist?
That's so funny because, like, to hear your perspective, because my perspective of him only came from my research for this cast, really. I hadn't necessarily heard, I maybe read in passing, but as I'm sure you guys have learned by now, I'm not the greatest with, like, putting names to poems. So if I saw one of his poems, I might say, oh, I absolutely recognize that, but I might not remember his name. And in my reading, I figured out that, in fact, he was so known for his immorality that Ada Lovelace's mom was so concerned about it, and throughout Ada's life, went out of her way to try to ensure that her morality stayed, and was willing to go to crazy lengths, it sounds, to check in on that aspect of her life, because she wasn't super present in Ada's upbringing, as it sounds. I think a grandma or something took care of her. I don't know if you guys can speak to that more, but fascinating that dad was out. He was busy until until she was about 7 or 8 when he passed away, and mom was so concerned that she might become some immoral, monstrous version of dad that she too was out of the picture, which, honest to God, just sounds like a 20th century saga, because I'm in this world right now where my parents are recently divorced, and it's not that bad, but like, I was surprised by the familial drama that I learned reading about this icon, Ada Lovelace.
I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure her mother was in the picture. And correct me if I'm
Some,
wrong.
but
We
not
might need to-
a ton.
maybe not a ton.
I don't remember very specifically how involved her mother was or not. I know she was like one of the main reasons why Ada was pushed into science and math, to your point, to both your points, really. Like, Ada's mother really had a strong disdain for Lord Byron and his mercurial nature.
Yeah.
Which, like, obviously a lot of people romanticize him because he's this amazing wordsmith and this charmer and he's handsome. But that type of, like, the same thing that made him, like, a great poet and, like, charmer was also the mercurial, like, crazy, wild nature. Like, he can't be tied down, which made him a really bad, probably, like, slightly emotionally abusive husband, right?
Yeah.
Which I'm sure she's just kind of like, I'm sure, like, everybody who's held a close relationship to him was just, like, really insecure, really fearing that he's going to abandon them, and they'd be right, because that is kind of how his relationships went.
Yeah.
He was just this kind of, escapator and Rolling Stone, kind of living a rock star lifestyle back in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. So, according to Wikipedia, Lovelace did not have a close relationship with her mother, and like I said, she was often left in the care of her maternal grandmother. So, while she was involved in her life, she was not overtly involved, and while she also pushed her into math and science, not to the extent that you might expect, depending on what story you hear. What I also saw that was fascinating is that she frequently wrote, she meaning Ada's mom, wrote letters to the grandmother to show maternal affection, but then had a cover letter to her letter saying, like, yo, mom, like, I'm not that interested in this child, but please keep these letters for record of maternal affection. Because in that state of time, or in that period of time, it was more common for men maybe to have the ability to keep their child if they wanted.
Oh, really?
That's fascinating.
I had no idea.
Yeah, so that's a bit of what I read into that crazy familial story.
I think another thing that's probably playing a role too is, so I know that so Ada had quite a privileged upbringing, and I can't remember exactly her mother's background, but one thing with wealth comes servants, and parents tend to stay occupied with their business. And then I mean, she I think had a number of tutors, and so a lot of her time was occupied being cultivated by these tutors into the math star that she was. But yeah, I'm sure that kind of led to some distance in her relationship with her mother. But go ahead.
While we're thinking about tutoring and Math Star, I would love to just explain a little bit to any listeners, especially any women, and especially anyone tied to young kids and specifically young girls, that math doesn't come supernaturally to the brain, and most all research that's out there shows that literally time spent on math will result in better math capabilities. So I tutor some young ladies in math, and I just want to shout that out, is that there's great evidence showing that just time spent in math and practicing those skills and cultivating those skills will create a better mathematician. So for Ada Lovelace, and maybe for any young aspiring girls who are wanting to get better at math, or like me are feeling not so good at math and are wanting to practice more, I think that's a great moment to highlight or piece of Ada's story.
Yeah. I think too, on that note, it reminds me of I believe it was in the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, where he looked at the mathematical abilities of different cultures, and in the US in particular compared to the Japanese, when presented with a puzzle that was challenging to figure out, the American students were would more rapidly give up on the puzzle when they weren't able to solve it. And that was hypothesized as one of these reasons for the comparative lack of mathematical abilities between Americans in particular, is just like this unwillingness to endure confusion. And so and just enduring the confusion and the willingness to do so tends to lead to better math abilities. So don't be afraid to fail. Just try a lot of different approaches, and one might work.
I wonder if that is part of just if that's part of a difference in the way that our culture sees math, with perhaps we have a fixed mentality, like you're good at math or you're not good at math, which I think is really common in the United States. Mm-hmm. But what I don't know as much about would be the Japanese culture. Is that, you said Japanese, right?
Yeah, it was Japanese, yeah.
They maybe they just have an idea surrounding math that it's just like it's just like like laying bricks. It's just like the harder you work, the more you go at it. Like eventually you're gonna build that wall or whatever, that mausoleum. So I wonder how they teach that, or if that's what they teach, or why they persevere so much with mathematics specifically. It's really interesting.
It is really interesting. And something that I would suggest our listeners look into is the cultural differences of mathematical abilities, because there's all sorts of different factors that play a role. One other is in Chinese, the language itself. It seems that the language is more, or just the language is more conducive to counting and keeping track of numbers, and thus addition and subtraction. So they tend to be better at operations at a younger age.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
But yeah, definitely worth looking into. To get back on Ada Lovelace, though, so she got math and science drilled into her. Mm-hmm. At the age of 13, she designed a mechanical bird. And then at 17, she went to Charles Babbage's dinner party, where he unveiled the difference maker. Do either of you guys want to touch on the difference maker?
I don't really, but no. I do want to just say.
Babbage.
I do want to just say that the first time I heard of Ada Lovelace's story, and then like the difference makers in a documentary, and I was super just disenfranchised. It did not seem that cool. It's like this big hunk of machinery. It's not sexy like Apple makes all their stuff. It's not like, I was just like, wow, this is this is the big deal. Are you serious? This is a huge, like, chunky, glommy looking machine. And of course I come to learn the significance of it, and I'm hoping Aidan can talk more about that. But like at first glance, I was amazed that this was the first like inspiration of a potential computer program. It was baffling to me that this big, just kind of ugly, monstrous machine that I think just was like a glorified calculator at the time, it was kind of the beginnings, the seed that was planted in Ms. Lovelace. So I'll let you take it from there, Aidan.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to share that initial impression.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that. So that was one of the. So Lauren and I had watched. There's an Ada Lovelace documentary that we'll link in the show notes. And I'm not sure, Dre, did you watch the same one or?
No, I didn't watch any documentary.
Okay. Well, so in it, they talk about how she went to this dinner party. She was 17 at the time, but she just got enamored with this machine because she started to see the potential for it.
Mm-hmm.
And the machine, like Lauren says, it's giant and clunky, but it was so cutting edge at the time because it could solve mathematical equations using addition and subtraction. Is kind of my basic understanding of it. And a crank, yeah. So it was, you could set a few settings, and then like there was a mechanical crank, and it could solve these equations. And it was groundbreaking at the time because then the term computer was a job title. So to solve a lot of these hard to solve equations, they would hire teams of math geeks, computers, or people to solve all of these equations by hand. And so it was kind of the first step into automating that process. And Ada looked ahead of her time and saw the potential of it and got really involved with Charles Babbage in inventing and things of that sort. But yeah.
You may want to clarify really involved, because today that could mean quite a few different things.
From my understanding, it was a mentor-mentee relationship where he was this big inventor. I'm not exactly sure how the relationship formed. I'm not sure if either of you guys became aware of that, if she wrote a letter or whatever it was, but she started working with him on some of his different projects.
And I was reading, I don't know if it's a book series or a TV series, but I think there was a series that was made that very much romanticized that relationship, just to, of course, create drama or whatever. But in the historical records, it shows that they had just a professional relationship. So I just wanted to clarify, though, because I think people hear involved and they're like, oh my gosh, they were involved.
Right, older man, younger woman too. It's just kind of like, but that was my understanding of it too. It was like strictly like a mentorship. Like they both love science. He saw like how great of a mind she was, and how she would one day surpass her teacher. Yeah,
I think in my understanding of both some of the letters and this initial meeting is that he was just taken by her brain power, right? Like he was just, I think amazed by her view to see something different or the future with this basic analytical engine.
Yeah, to a lot of your guys' points and how you guys are describing these engines, these machines, these primitive computers, I think like I'm kind of with you there's a lot of times, and I'm saying like I agree with how you kind of viewed the machine when you saw it, not saying like this is why you viewed it like this, but sometimes for me when I see some of these old kind of machines or breakthroughs or like equations, like I think a lot of it just kind of is kind of over my head, where I'm just like, it seems so simple and so like dumb or something like that. I just don't really get it. Like for example, like so if I was Ada Lovelace, if I was at that party and I see it, I would have just been like, oh yeah, like okay, like whatever that thing is, like but Ada, she's such a, and I don't know if we've like clarified this enough to our listeners, but it's like this is one of the greatest minds to ever live. Like she's brilliant, and not only like she inherited her analytical mathematical side from her mother, and also the poetic side from her father, and later on in life, or during her life, she credited the marriage of poetry and mathematics and the sciences as one of the reasons why she was able to make these breakthroughs. And to the point of like kind of her seeing this machine and understanding what this could be more than what it was. Mm-hmm. There's a quote by someone else who was at the party, one of her tutor's wives, that said, "When most of the guests looked on with the expression that the savages show on seeing a looking glass, Miss Byron, young as she was, understood its working and saw the great beauty of the invention." So whereas like I'm just looking at this clunky machine, like Ada Lovelace is out here just like seeing the future and seeing what it could be and seeing like how that's going to turn into this MacBook.
Yeah, at age 17.
At 17.
Which is wild to say. So I just also want to say to our listeners, so we're recording this podcast in Minnesota, and I had no idea this existed in Minnesota, but I'm starting grad school at the University of Minnesota, and I was biking to the library the other day, and I came across the Charles Babbage Institute, which is housed at the University of Minnesota. So
fascinating.
If you're wanting to learn more about Ada Lovelace, they've got plenty of archives there that you can request more information on. But yeah, it was just funny. I was just biking around, and we had already decided to do this podcast, and then I ran into the Charles Babbage Institute on my bike.
Yeah, so I think we've started to touch some on her significance as both a person, as a brilliant mind, also her significance in mathematics. I think the most telling piece of information that I learned for me to really understand the gravitas of her mathematical and computer programming abilities, and I don't want to necessarily say that like she knew how to get from A to B, because it seems that history might disagree on that specific piece, but that at the end of the day, when we saw a calculator, she saw something that could create symphony and create music, and that made a lot of sense to me as a musician, because there are people who see a piano and see, keys that strike and make notes, and when I see a piano, I see majors and minors and melodic scales, and I see from like the beginning to the end, and I see with like the ability to hear as I see, and like move my fingers as I hear and as I see, and create things from my mind. And that understanding, I think it was a quote I saw somewhere, but that understanding was the most had the most gravity for me to understand, like you said, this window of her mind that opened up into kind of the future. So that was just what resonated for me.
I think so on both of your points, as far as crediting her understanding of poetry and her ability to then see forward into the future. So Charles Babbage, there's a quote from the documentary where Babbage saw numbers, Lovelace saw music, and so in her writings, she described the potential of these machines, and to elaborate too. So the difference maker was developed to solve one specific problem, but then Babbage and her started working on his concept of an analytical engine, and the idea of that was more general purpose. So it had a set of rules very similar to what our computers use today, where there are if-else statements, which I could elaborate on, but I won't here. I'll let you guys do your common science research. But starting to get into the realm of using a computer in Babbage's eyes to solve more different mathematical equations, but in Lovelace's eyes to start to use them as a tool for creative expression. And I think now, looking at Spotify and all these other different apps out there, it's in hindsight, it's very easy to see that potential, but to think that Lovelace, 100 years even before Alan Turing and his contributions to computer science, could see this is quite extraordinary.
I think I completely agree. What I was also fascinated by, though, I started my research with this documentary, which just upheld Ada Lovelace to be this absolutely exquisite mind, and genius. And I think there is a ton of truth to that. But as my research went on, I also learned that there are other people who disagree with her being one of the first computer programmers, and I was a bit surprised by the controversy that there would be such differing views. But some biographers, computer scientists, and historians of computing claim completely otherwise. And in fact, this is one quote that I pulled from Wikipedia that I thought was just profound. It said, "All but one of her programs cited in her notes had been prepared by Babbage from 3 to 7 years earlier. The exception was prepared by Babbage for her, although she did detect a bug in it. Not only is there no evidence that Ada ever prepared a program for the analytical engine, but her correspondence with Babbage shows that she did not have the knowledge to do so." So I was surprised to find a claim that strong about this controversy.
Yeah.
And I went on to do some reading and digging and ended up finding a more lengthy article written and published in like a scientific journal about women in math and science and computer programming being like repeatedly ignored and like having their contributions tucked away and like undermined. So that made me reinvigorated in her story a little bit more, because I resonate with that in some ways as a woman in science.
Yeah, I think that pointing to the controversy is important, and I think that it'll be good to do your research and try to figure out what makes the most sense in your eyes. But I think that, so one aspect I do see as far as maybe why we might so romanticize her, or why this documentary might have so upheld her as this genius and all these things, is that she died so early. So she died at 36 and ended up kind of drifting into obscurity after her relationship with Charles, or her mentor-mentee relationship with Babbage kind of started to deteriorate. And so, like, I think that we do tend to have this bias towards the young genius and trying to like romanticize that. And I'm wondering if you guys see that, or if you guys have other thoughts on the reasons why we might uphold her, or why we might not.
I think in my research, I saw that the controversy was pointed toward some of the correspondence records, specifically some of her correspondence with Augustus de Morgan, I guess, have been redated several times throughout the historical record of Ada Lovelace's life. And I understand then, of course, that there would be controversy if it looks like she's just learning some math concept through correspondence 7 years after some other thing was supposed. It would make sense then that people would question now. And I hope that we can continue to rectify the issue, because this is from the abstract of the article that I read about A Simple Solution to a Lengthy Controversy, Ada Lovelace. And it says, despite this correction of the academic record of her mathematical abilities in these correspondence, the error persists in popular depictions of her work, undermining Lovelace herself and women in general. More scholarly examinations of historical women in STEM would enrich our understanding of their contributions and bolster their positions as role models. So, I mean, as much as I think we want to romanticize the young genius, I also think there's a huge desire to undermine, like, women in STEM. And I don't know where that comes from, per se, but it seems, I mean, of course, this is my own common science research, but it seems that that is partly where maybe some of the controversy comes from. This misstating of letters, of course, but I think there are then some egos involved. Speculation, mostly, but, like,
Yeah, I had heard the controversy, but I guess I didn't hear or read it specifically into it like you did, because some of that you read didn't sound familiar, and I didn't, like you said, I didn't know that it was like so substantiated, whether that substantiation was fake or not, like whether being manipulative with the numbers or whatever they were doing.
Right.
But yeah, I definitely come away thinking that the controversy was largely like she was like, we can agree that she probably could be considered like the first programmer or whatever, like or whatever sort of accolades and praise that we've showered her with, she deserves. And I mean, I don't know honestly, but one of the things that makes me think that she does deserve it, or that perhaps like this is kind of just some sort of way to bury women in STEM and all that stuff, is because Charles Babbage was like crazy fond of her, and he was a great mind, and he was the creator of the difference machine. He was the co-creator of the analytical engine, and he constantly praised her. And I didn't remember seeing anything where, I know that they did have a falling out, and part of that was because as they were trying to get some of their creations out there, I think the analytical engine might have been the main one. Like Charles Babbage was really bad with politicians. He was really bad like advocating and marketing the stuff, and he
not well spoken.
Yeah, he constantly butted heads with them, like would like call them names, like slander them and stuff like that, and maybe not slander, but just like talk to them like disparagingly. And so Ada was like, at one point he read a letter, she wrote to him or asked him like, hey, like let me take this over so that we can get this funding and get what we need to do to get this out. And he was just like, no, like we're not doing that, blah blah. And I think that was like a key part in how they kind of start to not see eye to eye, and like most mentor-mentee relationships, they kind of start going the different directions. But I don't remember ever reading anything where he was like, hey, Ada Lovelace doesn't deserve these accolades, she didn't do this, she didn't do that. Right. And I feel like he would be the main guy who would say that if it were true.
And I think beyond that too, like I from my understanding, and you guys can correct me or not, but that Alan Turing was quite, he admired her work quite substantially, and Alan Turing, inventor of the Turing test, modern computing. Like, to have somebody like that uphold her work in such high esteem, similarly, I think would point more to the undermining of the female role in science. But
I think too it speaks some to like a mentee-mentor relationship in science in general, where at any point in time a mentee might posit something that's brilliant, and maybe they don't know how to write the program to get it from A to B or A to C, but sometimes it's the vision that's needed to like kick the mathematicians in the pants a little to get them to like think beyond the math to create these abstract connections. And so I think, too, maybe that's where some of that controversy can come to, where some people might say, like, oh, Ada Lovelace never could have written that program. Right, but I think there's a difference between, like, pounding it out and knowing the ones and zeros and then
Steve
relating,
Jobs
like...
could have never made the MacBook without Wozniak. Yeah.
Right, and relating that vision.
Yeah, that's a good point. And just, like... to like mentor mentee group, whatever, it's like you're always gonna be standing on the shoulders of giants. Like every famous person that was famous for inventing this or doing that or innovating this, it's like, well, how many people did they work with, how many people did they have in the lab, how many whatever.
Even us here on Common Science, I think of the many people who got my speaking abilities to where they are today, and of course I have lots of growth yet to come, and my science abilities, I mean, I'm standing on a lot of giants, a lot of people that I really look up to and respect, and I think the best you can do is, show up and ask questions in the world, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's one challenging aspect of science is the idea of credit, because in particular today there's the publish or perish phenomenon where if you're, the more articles you're on and the more prestigious the journal, you tend to be rewarded in terms of appointments at a university or whatever else, and it's kind of this fascinating, it's like how much credit is, or how much it's a highly subjective process where people are like deciding when somebody should be an author on a scientific paper or not. But that's just something that it reminds me of too, is this idea of credit is just kind of, I mean, it's inherent in humans, like wanting to get credit. I witnessed, I think it was, we were at a funeral the other day, and there were these two kids, and one of them cleaned up the toys, and then they both go up, and the mom says, "Good job," to both of the kids for cleaning up the toys. And the little girl pipes up and says, but I did all the work. And so the mom is like, "Oh yeah, you'll get credit where credit's due. Like, oh, good job. And like, you should have done more on your part," to the little boy. But it was just funny, like even to this young age, seeing the desire to get credit, but it also seems quite arbitrary when you're talking about standing on the shoulders of giants. Anyways, winding thought.
Yeah, no, it's great though. But I think even specific to Ada Lovelace dying at a fairly young age, I don't know that she ever received the praise due while she was living. I mean, I think many of her mentors, of course, encouraged her and praised her, but I think we appreciate and understand her as a figure in history better now than we did when she was living. And I think that is true for a lot of scientific accomplishments for women, especially in earlier periods of history. But I'm appreciative that I now know more about her and her contributions to science and computer science specifically.
Yeah, it's funny to me that, I mean, it kind of reminds me of the George Washington Carver episode because growing up, I don't remember ever learning about Ada Lovelace, and I'm starting to hear more of her. And I think that is super awesome, but it is also just kind of like the history books. It feels like leaving out certain groups of people, but even in her lifetime too, she also didn't end up getting the funding or credit. She ended up dying in debt and with regrets at the age of 36. She had cancer of the womb. And her extraordinary work was forgotten for like a good 100 years until Alan Turing rediscovered it. But it is just kind of sad to me in my eyes that 100 years ahead of like the father of modern computing, there was already like somebody who saw the potential of computing, and that was lost so early.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like while I was reading this, learning about Ada, preparing for this podcast, I was kind of like, I kept thinking of Alan Turing and thinking about the movie Imitation Game and this and that, and like it was really hard for me to kind of reconcile the two ideas, because I was like, how are these, like it's a very similar story, but just obviously on a different scale. Obviously he stood on the shoulders of Ada Lovelace. But I was kind of like trying to think about these things, like how are these things so far apart? How have I heard of Alan Turing so many times in my life, never really heard of Ada Lovelace, this and that? So to your point, yeah, I agree that part of it, like obviously she's just being, I don't know, like overshadowed or like not going back to the women with STEM and the history of that. Is my voice getting kind of weird? Is there something stuck in my throat?
Maybe.
My throat, like I'm like, I can hear myself. I'm like, I sound weird, but nothing funny about her dying from cancer, but there's a fun fact about her, about when she died. She died at age 36, and that is the exact same age that her father died. And we talked a bit about Lord Byron in the beginning of the cast. Although she had kind of a long-term hatred for her mother for whatever reason, maybe her mother was too overbearing, maybe it's because her mother hated her father, Lord Byron. Not 100% sure where all the disdain came from. But she had a lifelong infatuation with her father, even though she never really knew him. She just knew who he was because he was super famous and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So she had this lifelong infatuation. She wanted to be with him. She wanted to know him. She wanted to be like him. It's part of the reason why, even though she had math and science drilled into her, she still was also a poet. She considered herself a poet. She attributed poetry as one of the reasons why she was able to make some of her breakthroughs. So that's kind of interesting. And she was also buried next to Lord Byron and not her mother.
Yeah.
So kind of interesting how that her story came full circle. And again, going back to like, if you thought of like if Lord Byron would have been, if she would have been the child that Lord Byron wanted, that'd be like so poetic. It's like you raised this kid. She is pretty much like a perfect combination, amalgamation of the mother's analytical mind and your mercurial poetic mind, and then she ends up dying at the same age as you for completely different causes because he died in a war, and then she gets buried alongside you.
Yeah, it's
a poetic.
It's a poetic end to her story, but I mean, honestly, kind of the beginning as well, in terms of how her work has been re-recognized and continues to gain more recognition. One quote by her that I think is quite demonstrative. I don't know. Demonstrative. That's the word I'm looking for. Is if you can't give me poetry, can't you give me poetical science? And so she was very, very fascinated and wrapped up into this idea of poetical science and trying to see the human in the science and blend the two. Here's another quote that I'm curious what it evokes in the two of you is religion to me is science and science is religion.
I like it. I like it a lot. Yeah. Like for me as a common scientist and a Christian, and when I say Christian, I largely mean like a believer in God. And I think that nature and science and the natural order of things often points to something larger, something bigger, more connectivity than we might ever have realized, more intuitive, more intuitiveness, I'm not sure if it's quite the right word, but of the human body, of the way that ecosystems interact. And I think a lot of that we can show in science to the best of our abilities, but often nature had it figured out better for longer, and like nature will prevail in the end, I think. And I think that those two pieces do really bring together science and like God or science and something bigger.
What about you, Dry?
I don't know what to make of that. That's interesting. I'd like to have a conversation with her about that quote.
Yeah.
Sometimes I've heard religious people say like there's no such thing as secular, right? Because like if there's a God, then everything belongs to God.
Yeah.
And I've said like everything is science, you know? It's just like, there's no such thing as anything outside of science. The science is life. Science is, if you're human at least, it's like you are a scientist if you're human, and you're going to experience the world through a scientific lens to one extent or another. Some like to be a little bit more ascientific than that than I care for, but in general it's like you experience, you get evidence, data, you get feedback, you adjust, and you try again, right? It's just like it's the way we're born. So in that sense, I mean, sure.
Yeah, science is religion. It's funny that you say that. Yeah, science is everything. I think, I mean, just to echo both of you, seeing the interconnectedness, like her seeing the numbers and the music, and connecting the two through science, I think is just remarkable and kind of, been a theme throughout our podcast as we've explored topics from Ada Lovelace, George Washington Carver, string theory. I mean, you name it, we've covered. We haven't covered it because there's infinitely many topics to cover, but
we did do the string theory episode, so
we did do the string theory.
Pretty much covered it. All the dimensions.
All the dimensions. Theory of everything, all that. But yeah, I mean, it's just to me just a reminder of kind of this, remarkable life and somebody who is so dedicated to science and figuring things out.
Yeah, and I think too that you really can't ever know or comprehend the impact that your own life might have. And here's just one example of something that exists today because of Ada Lovelace. The article that I referenced earlier about women in STEM was written by a biased character for sure, but I would say biased in the right ways. Sue Chairman Anderson, who's the founder of FindingAda.com, which aims to inspire and support women in science, technology, engineering, and math with 3 major projects: Ada Lovelace Day, an international celebration of women's achievements in STEM; the Finding Ada Conference, which is an online event covering careers, equality, and widening participation; and the Finding Ada Network, an online mentorship platform for women in STEM. So, I mean, just one example of how you might not ever know the impact you're having in your own life, or you could have in your own life, by just showing up and pursuing common science and asking questions in the world and engaging with the world, whether it's through a lens of science and we hope some common science, or something else that you're passionate about, but getting out and asking questions. I think with that, common scientists, we're so glad you tuned in for this cast on Ada Lovelace. I hope that you learned something about her life and maybe how you can think about science and engineering in your own life, and maybe a little bit too about your impact in the world and in the future. And that's it for Common Science this week. We're excited to see you next week.
Hey Common Scientists, hope you enjoyed the cast. Thanks for investing in Common Science. We hope it brought as much value to you as it did to us.
To learn more, smash the subscribe button and visit our website, commonscientists.com, where you can read our blog, join our email newsletter, and follow us on social media.
Finally, if you like what we have to say, you can absolutely support us on Patreon. We could always use more support. You can navigate there also from our website, commonscientists.com, common scientists with an S, so that we can continue cultivating a community of common scientists.